Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of Voices of Legacy. Be sure to stay tuned tomorrow for the 2022 Legacy Awards. This is a Hurston Wright event, and we are so excited to have our authors in the room. We have Clemence Hurd reading from Tragic City. We have Lady Hubbard reading from Rib King, and we have Alea Dawn Johnson reading from Reconstruction. So we're going to start out with Clemence Hurd. Clemence Hurd is the author of the poetry collection Tragic City, which won the 2020. Clem, say that. Say that word, please.
The Anhinga Press.
Anhinga, which won the 2020 Anhinga Robert Dana Poetry Prize, selected by Major Jackson, and investigates the events of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. He received a 2018 to 2019 Tulsa Artist Fellowship. Are those the correct years? I don't think so. And was the 2019-2020 Ronald Wallace Poetry Fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm going to say, Clem, you were probably a 2017-2019 Tulsa Artist Fellow, or 20, something like that. Is that about right? I try to stay in all your business. I try to stay in all your business. I'm a true fan. So can we get it popping with you, Clem? Can you read us an excerpt?
Definitely. I'm so glad to be here. And I'm so glad that Candace is hosting this, since we go back to James Madison, Furious Flower. We go back to a seminar, a Yusuf Komunyakaa seminar, Furious Flower. And shout out to Joanne Gavin, who just retired not that long ago. So I'm going to read one. Let's see, I'll read two from the book. I'll start with one from the book. And I'm just going to say this book is mainly about Tulsa, my time in Tulsa and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. But I've been trying to figure out different ways to read it. And so I think I'm going to just stay in, we're not going to be in Tulsa today. We're going to stay in Oklahoma City for the three pieces that I have. And each piece will be substantially longer than the one that came before. So here's the shortest one. And it's titled The Light Bulb Room, after Ralph Ellison. The best way to advertise may be to leave the lights on. Showcase the chandeliers until the vandals clear out. The whats and whatnots, the fixtures fizzing behind the glass like a cathode's paunched picture. Overhead is what hangs above. Overhead is who does the hanging. Overhead is that ridiculous ass utility bill you keep on paying. Triple entendre, don't even ask me how. I think Edison's edify Ellison better than any other bulb. It's almost invisible skin and filament filling in where my reasoning should have been. But these bright lights turn me to a monster. Please love me with your whole lobotomy. Screw my head back on. I am drawn like our mother to a store's facade. I can't afford anything. All right.
You're muted.
Muted? Okay, somehow I muted me. All right. So this next poem is not in the book, but I was thinking about Candace hosting, and I was thinking about all the people that I met, all the friends that I made whenever we were in the fellowship, and thinking about like, what are some times we had together? And so this poem was written after the book was published, but it's one where a friend of Candace and mine, Christina, took us on a Black Town tour of Oklahoma. And so kind of just digging into Oklahoma's rodeo history, we got to go to the nation's oldest continuously held Black rodeo in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. So this is on that. Here we go. It's titled Love on Top. If your sugar pie sleeps with a pillow like a bit between their thighs, and you would like to spoon at some point in the night, then you must mount that same pillow and ride the white horse into psychedelic dreams neither of you will recall once aroused. Dreams of Black townships, rodeos, of kids no older than 5 fixed on the high fence as ponytails whip around the barrels. In your dream, Black teens trot across the grounds natural as their brown fingers tilling land. You be wise to mind the dung, the charger's pendulums sweeping the wind on your way back to the boots that sell boots and cowboy hats. The many hot dog concession stands, nachos dressed in peppers and cheese, the same gospel of lukewarm, God claim he'd hawk and spit right out. You got to be sure in your decision. Can't just canter into revelations more trippy than any bulldogger could fathom. No, you got to trust in the phantoms you're racing against as opposed to clocks. The announcer quips, looks like someone's horse is going home without them. Take note of winding arms in the final relay where the crowd favorite puts on a show. Neck to neck with the less experienced who wanted more. Thus, love on top, like so. All right, thank y'all so much for spending some time with us and for listening. I'm gonna try to make sure I don't go over this 8, but I feel like I'm close. So this one is the last poem and another one in Oklahoma City, and it's titled Hot Girl Summer. You can kind of see in the book there's like this graph happening, but I'll read all that, and if y'all get the book, y'all can let me know what y'all think about it. Hot Girl Summer. I'd grown up on Partners in Crime's New Orleans block party, but it was unwinding under the hipped roof and awning of my hippie friends and listening to their teen daughter and sidekick that I got hipped to the unadulterated meaning of Hot Girl Summer. Megan Thee Stallion, Nicki Minaj, and Ty Dolla $ign having combined their parentally advised talents to compose an anthem to young women around the world who looked to be hot but not stolen. The music video, as you may well know it, is a pool party of women thirst twerking and tongue poking on hot pink chases. Back in my day, this video might have been subjected to BET Uncut segment, which may be one step away from porn. Instead, the 2 teens adorned in loose jeans and crop tops told us the older hot guy they'd spotted coming out of Walmart, how they approached who they called a fine, middle-aged gentleman, adding, Hot Girl Summer simply meant you do what you want. I'd grown up on Rebirth brass bands, Do What You Wanna, but eyeing their lithe midriffs and navels that squinted when they giggled, I couldn't help but wonder what were the limits to boldness. All of this on a porch in a city Oklahomans refer to as the city or the crossroads because of the web of interstates. All of this while my hippie friends, about as old as my parents, nodded attentive, listening to their only daughter and closest friend, who still engaged in sleepovers, talk about pursuing men while their son was off at college with students who knew every word and ad-lib, every word of their paranoid parents, directing how not to get taken advantage of. For a minute, lazing beneath strings of light, hard not to find enchanting, I thought of the security and scrutiny of close-knit neighborhoods. More peers meaning less disappearing. Then how a trafficker might believe more highways means the better their chances. I thought of the woman I had known in passing, a student whose face I recognized in a picture pinned to a corkboard of the coffee shop I'd frequented in grad school. New baristas, new students, same thumbtacks, same poster. Missing person, Darian Michelle Hudson, missing since October 24th, 2017. Last seen, Stillwater, Oklahoma. Height, 63 inches. Sex, female. Weight, 120 pounds. Eyes, brown. Hair, black. Tattoos, tattoo of a feather and 5 birds with the script birds of a feather flock together on the back of her right shoulder. See Name Us images. Contact Stillwater Police Department at 405-742-8357 with information. Case number 2017-32662. Name Us MP number 40719. I'd grown up on the Hot Boys and Big Timers. I Need a Hot Girl. And maybe the young woman who resembled my best friend had too. Darian, who, like my friend, went off to a small college town where the tallest structures were the stadiums and student unions, but was kidnapped. Where in the sultry summer, there were shades cloaking the cool and the cruel. Swimming pools and apartment buildings that cropped up like crop tops, coffee shops, cream rising to the top of their lattes. Quick run on a summer night that felt like any other. After a while, I've been asked if I'd like some tea or something to eat. My friend's Southwest hospitality having been snatched up by the heavy wind that, in another life, may have been a breeze. A wind that always seems to make its way around any structure to find us, sitting on a porch in a city, a state, a country, where the difference between citizens is who gets searched and who gets searched for. I hadn't grown up on Sugar Boys and his cane cutters, Giacomo, but I nodded my head in their offer as if to a song that wanted out. Their cat statuesque on the ledge, their blind dog pawing around. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Clem. Let's go ahead and get some applause in the chat. Thank you, Clem. That was wonderful. Woo! So you ended heavy. Let's start there. Clem, talk to us about the subject matter of Hot Girl Summer.
Hot Girl Summer is partly me thinking about two friends, one of whom just passed away this year. And but this was a friend I worked with the Ralph Ellison Foundation, and this was a friend who joined me when I was convening an event for them. And I spent a lot of time with them whenever I was in Oklahoma City. And it was partially my kind of head scratching on just how lax they were with their kids, and how like they were just like, yeah, you know. So it was originally just a judgment. It was like, man, like this is, but it began to make me think, you know, about, okay, well, you know, does that same ease apply to, you know, to Black children, Black women specifically, Black girls specifically? And, you know, that the quick answer was no. And so it's just my kind of meditating on that.
So you talk about trafficking in this poem as well. Like there are a few layers. We have this gender layer, we have this race layer, we also have this place layer, and the place layer comes with everything that Oklahoma is, but also part of that, what Oklahoma is a place where a lot of sex trafficking happens. Being this like crossroads of America. So can you go more into that and how that's working in your poem?
Place-wise, I mean, in terms of, I'm a driver. So in terms of place, I don't know just how much I was thinking about that. Like once I learned that Oklahoma City was nicknamed the Crossroads, it was kind of all I needed. It's kind of like all I needed to know, you know. And I think my emotional response though was to the, you know, Darien. Really, it was to the fact that I passed her several times in the coffee shop, just 50 minutes away from Oklahoma City. And you know, I want to say this is like my first year or two in grad school, and so just thinking about, you know, like to pass someone, you know, and then to and you know, I recognized it partly because we were, you know, two of the only Black people that visited the coffee shop, but to pass someone and then for them to wind up missing, and then to think about, you know, some of the, you know, what happens to people who get trafficked, right? And so kind of thinking about, you know, the porn industry, thinking about, you know, just, you know, people who are taken against their will, and so I just wanted to explore that, partly because it was, you know, it was just my reaction, and because I just couldn't get over it. Every time I went back to Stillwater, I would see this poster and think like, oh my God, it's like she's still missing. So I think it was less, geography is important, you know, what is it? Places, geography is fate, but it was more so me reacting to her not being here.
When it comes to the book as a whole, I want to back up for a second and I want you to talk to us about, I'm going to ask you two questions at once and you can kind of like, however you want. One, you in this reading made the strategic decision to not read Tulsa poems from the book that's primarily about Tulsa. I want to know more about that choice and how that was informed. And then also, I want you to talk about the title of the collection.
Yeah, thank you, Candace, for all of your questions. I think that I was just trying to keep it interesting for me. That's how I chose. It was like, okay, how can I choose something that's like a sequence for me? There was no like big, you know, big thing of like just reading. Yeah, I think because I picked some poems out last night, and one poem that I picked out last night took place in Tulsa. It doesn't mention Tulsa, but it's a poem called "Amazing Grace" that, you know, that goes off the Aretha Franklin in the documentary. But then I thought today, oh yeah, I got a poem. You know, I thought about, you know, our time in Okmulgee, and I was like, yeah, Candace I got a poem that I could read, you know, and because I'm just trying to think about relationship, and I'm trying to think about like, okay, I have a relationship with Candace, let's read that. And then I thought, okay, these other two poems, that's when the Ruff Ellison one came back. I was like, okay, I'll read that one. And the Hot Girl Summer one was already up there, mainly because it's a hard poem to read, partly because of the content, and also because, I mean, my friend just passed earlier this year. And so, you know, and she's about the age of my mom, right? And so it was more so like, okay, who can I honor, and how do I honor them?
And the title, Tragic City?
That's part of it is, you know, my great love for Yusuf Kamonyaka's Magic City. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, part of it is that, part of it is, you know, there are so many cities, you know, nicknamed Magic Cities for coming out of nowhere. But, you know, just thinking when I lived, you know, when I lived in Tulsa, we lived in two different buildings, but, you know, the building that I stayed in, there was Magic City Books, you know, beneath us. And yeah, I just thought looking out of my window every day and thinking about, oh yeah, this is where, the most violent, battle of the massacre took place. I thought, well, I don't know how magic it is. And it felt tragic. And so that was, originally it was Greenwood. And because I have a friend who disagreed. He was like, oh, Tragic City, who's from Tulsa, and then I said, it has to be Tragic City, because that's not just what I feel, but that's what reverberates, because there's still so much that has not been reconciled. So
beautiful. Clem, thank you for reading. Can you tell us where we can follow you? Can you tell us where you are right now? Like where are you working? What are you working on?
I'm right here. Follow me right here.
Come on now.
I ain't got no social media. So
okay, so you have a website?
Yeah, I have.
It's just my name. Phone number,
it's my name.com. And in terms of what I'm working on, essays and poems, and I'm writing about food. I've been farming. I've been farming this summer, and so writing about farming and a whole bunch of other family, some family stuff. So that's
beautiful. Thank you so much, everybody. Let's big up Clem in the comments. Clement's heard. Thank you for being here. Shout out to Tragic City. Shout out to the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, to Major Jackson, who selected him as an Anhinga Robert Dana Poetry Prize winner. So shout out to all those entities and people. Shout out to the Ronald Wallace Poetry Institute there at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So yes, thank you, Clem. Thank you, Clem. We're gonna move to Lady Hubbard, who is reading from Rib King. Lady is the author of the novels The Talented Ribkins, which received the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Debut Fiction. And Lady is the author of The Rib King. Her collection of short stories, The Last Suspicious Holdout, was published in March 2020. That's 2022. Sorry, it's all the same. It's the pandemic, guys. A year lasts like 7 years in the pandemic, so it is what it is. Lady is the recipient of a 2022 Guggenheim Fellowship and has also received fellowships and grants from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, the American Academy in Berlin, the Rhoda Jaffe Foundation, and Sakatar, among other organizations. She has earned a BA in English from Princeton University, an MFA in creative writing from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and a PhD in folklore and mythology from the University of California, Los Angeles. She currently lives in NOLA. Lady.
Hey, hi.
Hey. Go ahead and bless the mic for us.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm going to read from The Rib King. And I was just going to read part of the first chapter, which the book is set, the first half of the book is set in 1917. And Mr. Sitwell, the main character, is a household servant for a white family in Chicago. And let's see, I was going to start a few pages in. So when the book begins, he has seen he's on his way home after work. He's heading to a streetcar stop and he sees there's 3 orphans that work in the kitchen. And he sees one of them loitering in the front of the house. They're not supposed to be in the front of the house. And he decides to go back inside and retrieve the boy so he doesn't lose his position in the house. So I'm going to start there. Okay. It wasn't until he reached the back porch that it occurred to him why he was doing it. He liked these boys, cared about them, wanted them to do well. In the 20 years he'd worked for the Barclays, he'd seen dozens of orphans come and go and always thought it was a shame that Miss Mamie's predecessor, Mr. Boudreau, never did much to help them. He wasn't certain if it was something about these particular children or simply the fact that Miss Mamie handled her orphans so differently than Mr. Boudreau had handled his that had made such an impression on him. He'd noticed how careful they were not to tramp on his flowers when they walked through the garden, and he liked that they asked a lot of questions about herbs. He also liked that when they did ask questions, instead of scolding them for slacking the way Mr. Boudreau would have done, Miss Mamie seemed pleased they took an interest in something she considered useful. She was determined to actually teach them something and wanted them to leave the house knowing more than they had when they arrived. It was clear that she cared for them, and because of that, Mr. Sitwell found he couldn't help but care for them too. He stepped inside the house. Also, of course, there was the fact that he had started out like them, a waterfront orphan, beneficiary of the peculiar mingling of the Barclays' need for cheap labor and their relatively liberal views on children's reform. Mr. Sitwell was only 14 when he was plucked from the yard of an asylum. He started in the kitchen, and while other orphans came and went, he'd managed to stay on, gaining more and more of the Barclays' confidence through a combination of talent, wit, and fealty. He passed through the kitchen, pushed into the pantry, pushed into the dark kitchen, then stopped when he saw Ginny, the new chambermaid, standing by the window next to a large set of napkins set out on the work table, all tucked into three-corner folds. She had her back to him and was looking out at the yard, a cigarette in her hand. When she heard him come in, she turned around and smiled. Evening. Mr. Sitwell nodded. He could feel the muscles in his face tighten and was glad the room was dark. He'd been practicing talking to Ginny in the mirror at the rooming house where he lived. He knew he had an unfortunate habit of frowning at pretty women, and also that he looked ugly when he did. You're here late. I had to finish these. She nodded to the stack. Mr. Sitwell struggled to fit his face into a smile as calm and cool as hers. Miss Mamie making you stay to do all that? Honestly, she told me to do it this morning. I forgot. Ginny said, one arm wrapped in front of her waist, the other hand holding a cigarette. Don't tell her. Mr. Sitwell arched his eyebrows in an effort to keep his brow from furrowing over. How you getting home, Ginny? What on earth do you mean? I just mean it's late. Is it? She glanced at the clock on the counter near the stove. 9? Well, I guess it depends who you ask. She was still smiling. Mr. Sitwell had noticed that about her. She smiled a lot, had a way of talking to people as if what she really wanted to do was laugh at them. When she first started working there 2 months before, it had hurt his feelings a couple times before he realized that she talked to everybody like that, even Miss Mamie, that it was just her way. I could walk you to the streetcar if you'd like. Make sure you get there safe. He looked away from her towards the sink and was disappointed when he saw the stack of dirty pots still piled there. Well, aren't you sweet, Ginny said. That's real nice, Sitwell. Honestly, I can't imagine a girl needs much protection in this neighborhood, never mind the hour, but I certainly would appreciate the company. Mr. Sitwell nodded and looked back at the pots. If the Barclays didn't send those boys back to the asylum for wandering the halls at night, Miss Mamie just might if they were stupid enough to leave a mess like that. Could you wait a few minutes? I just got to take care of something right quick. All right, Sitwell, I don't mind waiting. Give me a chance to put these napkins away. She flicked her cigarette out the window. Mr. Sitwell reached down to straighten his tie, then pushed through the swinging door that led to the front of the house. As he passed through the dining room, his heart was beating fast, but he had to figure that hadn't gone so bad. He'd been trying to think of questions to ask Ginny since she started working there, but that was the first time they'd been alone. Ginny, he decided, was a nice person. And looking back on their conversation, not scary at all. A lot of people on staff didn't know what to make of her, in part because of all the smiling, but also because they were still adjusting to the fact that Petunia, the woman she'd replaced, was indeed gone. Petunia's termination had been a shock, not because she'd been good at her job, but because she'd been there doing her job badly for so long. When Mamie got promoted and took charge of the kitchen, it seemed like the first thing she did was send Petunia home. He walked up a short flight of stairs and entered the main hall, the chandelier above him shining a harsh light on the objects in Mrs. Barclay's cabinet. He looked at the pistol that had so entranced Bart and noticed at once that the gilt was peeling on the handle. Several other items on the shelves were chipped or otherwise damaged. Electric lighting, which seemed necessary only because everyone else on the block now had it, had not been kind to this house. There was a reason for the care Mrs. Lawson, the parlor maid, took to ensure each lamp was covered with a cloth of a particular weight when company came to dinner. Some of the rugs in the hall were worn down and frayed from overuse. There were water stains on the side tables in the parlor, and the velvet cushions of the couch in the conservatory were sun-bleached in places. All of these flaws had been there for years, but they were made disturbingly visible in the new glare. He continued down the hall. He still remembered when he was a boy, like the three he was looking for now, how fine the house had seemed to him, the glitz and glitter of the various curios in Mrs. Barclay's cabinet, sparkling in the warm glow of the gas lights. There'd been a time when he was convinced this was not simply the finest house he'd ever seen, but perhaps the finest there ever was. Then one day when he was 15, he was standing in the front yard and happened to look beyond the Barclays fence. For the first time, it occurred to him that most of the other houses on the avenue were twice the size of the one where he worked, that the Barclays had neighbors who, if they wanted to, could have bought and sold both his employers and everything they owned several times over. He must have looked over that fence 1,000 times before this actually occurred to him. Before that, the house had always just been another part of the block, an extension of the world it belonged to, and therefore extremely precious. He moved past the stairs. Perhaps the Barclays weren't as rich and important as they once were, but it was still a good house. The boys had a good thing there, whether they realized it or not. What they'd been given wasn't exactly charity, but it was better than the industrial college where scores of boys and girls shivered on cold factory floors 14 hours a day. Here they worked hard, but they slept on warm cots at night, and Miss Mamie made sure they were always well fed. The Barclays were not crazy enough to be unmanageable and, miraculously for the times, still maintain an entirely colored staff. The Barclays had come to the city from Missouri 35 years before with their cook, Mr. Boudreau. They did not believe in race mixing in the kitchen, rightly thought it caused too many problems. Because Mr. Boudreau had been colored, the rest of the staff, out of necessity, had to be colored too. When he finally left, Miss Mamie, his former assistant, had been the obvious choice to take his place. This meant that so long as she continued to cook and maintain order to the Barclays' satisfaction, the opportunity to be reformed in the kitchen would remain the exclusive preserve of 3 colored orphans between the ages of 14 and 15. When he reached the conservatory, he heard a loud "ooh," followed by a series of childish giggles. He pushed the door open and found the 3 boys huddled together on the floor near the piano, with Frederick in the center. From the halting sound of Frederick's voice, Mr. Sitwell could tell he was reading. Now that Cherokee knew that Wash Talbot, his former deputy, had been arrested, he had to make a choice. Keep his vow to never again set foot in Seminole County or let the last remaining member of his gang fall into the hands of an angry mob. "What are you boys doing?" They spun around in unison and blinked at him with enormous brown eyes. They were handsome children with bright round faces, thick eyebrows, full lips, and skin the dark red color of cedarwood. Their features were so similar that anybody would have mistaken them for actual brothers. In truth, they were not blood relatives at all. Their strong bond formed in the interest of survival on the waterfront. "Nothing, sir," Max smiled, eyes all innocent. "Just sitting here reading." "In front of the house?" "Oh, nobody saw us come in. We made sure them folks was long gone before we came here," Frederick said. He lifted his arms and rocked back and forth in imitation of someone else's waltz. "We waited till they finished dancing." Mr. Sitwell frowned. "Somebody saw you. I did. Saw Bart playing in the hall when I was on my way out. Then come to find you haven't even finished cleaning the kitchen." "Not true, sir. Kitchen's all done," Bart said. "Well, except for the pots. Remember last time how Miss Mamie told us not to disturb Mr. Barclay's guests with a lot of banging while folks were eating dinner? Figured this time we'd just wait until the dinner was over so as not to bother anybody." The boy looked very proud of himself. "It's all right, sir. We don't mind working late." The last guest left over an hour ago, Mr. Sitwell said. Really? Dang, it didn't feel like we'd been in here but 5 minutes. The boys stared at one another as if there was something wondrous about their shared trance. You mean to say we've been sitting here reading all that time? Mr. Sitwell held out his hand. Give it to me. Frederick gave him the book. On the cover was a picture of a tall, thin white man with green eyes and a long red beard, clutching a pistol in each hand. What is this? The Life and Times of Cherokee Red, Wild Man of the Reconstruction, Frederick said. You ever read it? No, but you heard about him, right? Started out during the war, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Now his gang's all busted up. He and his lady love moved out west to put the past behind him, and he's been trying his hand at being a farmer. But just when it seems like his gunslinging days are over, he finds out Wash Talbot, last surviving member of his gang, was caught stealing hogs and got himself locked up back in Florida. What? He stole a hog. Who did? Wash Talbot. Mr. Sitwell squinted at the cover. He'd never heard of Cherokee Red, but he knew the name Wash Talbot from when he was a boy back in Florida, just like in the book. He handed it back to Frederick. Where does it say that name? Show me. Wash Talbot. Frederick opened the book and started flipping pages. After a while, he set his finger down and read, another infamous member of the gang was Wash Talbot, who never would renounce his lawless ways. For years after the gang disbanded, he was still hiding out in the swamps of Seminole County, a terror to the neighboring towns. That's enough, Mr. Sitwell said. Pernicious lies. Sir, I knew that man. Who? Cherokee Red? Wash Talbot. He was a simple farmer. The boys looked disappointed. Probably not the same man then, Max said. Was your Wash from Seminole too? Mr. Sitwell shook his head. I don't recall. He was lying, compelled by a childhood admonishment to say nothing about where he came from, even though he realized there was no cause for it any longer. It was the same reason he'd refused to give his real name when, lured by the promise of food, he'd voluntarily entered the doors of the asylum 20 years before. And then, a few months after that, when he found himself standing on the Barclays' back porch, hands clasped behind his back and wedged between those two other boys. All right, I'll stop there. I don't know. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't go over my time. Felt like I was reading a long time. So,
Ooh, okay. Y'all, can we jump in the chat and give it up for Lady?
thank you.
Okay, so there were a lot of interesting juxtapositions here. I'm gonna throw some out at you so that you can kind of pick where you want to go with it. Okay. So it's interesting, this sense of home while also it not being home, right? Mm-hmm. Also, you're talking about, you then compare that home to the factory, or what it could have been. You have this idea of what's imagined versus what is real. Jenny wasn't as scary as he imagined her to be. The house wasn't as big as he imagined it to be. Then also the old and the new, there are better words for that, like the antique nature of the house with the modern advancements. There are all of these things just contradicting each other in this part of the chapter. Can you talk more about that?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's true. The part of the reason I wanted to read that part is because it's actually kind of condenses what the whole book is about for me. Because one thing does have to do, this book that the boys are reading is actually about his hometown that was destroyed by it was destroyed during the Reconstruction, and he thinks he's the sole survivor of this town. So it has a lot of what he says drives him crazy is not just the lies that the book represents, because the book tells this history, but tells it completely wrong. And all the characters in it are also white, but that it constantly reminds him of the truth. And so I think a lot of things are going on in there in terms of like the relative nature the book as a whole is a lot about performing, how they perform roles in the house. But then when they're sort of out of sight, you have a different sense of who they all are. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I mean, that added to it because it increases this, like, the imagined versus the reality.
Yeah.
This is the performance that we have here. Of course, this is not who we are in another space. And so that adds another layer to it. And then this false history, like putting those two words together in an oxymoronic way, is an interesting juxtaposition as well. So still, I mean, you just more contradictions on top of each other that you're teasing through.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were thinking through, I guess at any point in writing this book, and you wanted to create the false narrative as a launching point
Mm-hmm.
for, can you talk us through how you were thinking about that?
Well, yeah. So all of the characters in the first half of the book are the roles they perform in the front of the house are minstrel stereotypes, and they're very, the way they're constructed is in relation to that. And so I was really thinking about what it felt like to sort of inhabit these roles in the interest of survival, but it's not who they actually are. So yeah, so that was one thing that I was thinking about. There's just all these contradictions. And I think that it's not just the erasure of history, the erasure of identity. So that part has a lot to do with mass. It's not just the erasure, but that it constantly evokes the truth, right? Which is what makes it so painful. And ultimately he kind of loses his mind, because he just kind of loses it. And it's because of all these tensions that he has inside of him. And another thing that I was thinking about when I wrote it too was I started writing it. It was the events surrounding Trayvon Martin, and yeah, just a lot. And it made me think of masks. So I was thinking about, and I said, I think it in part was because there was all that just weird talk about hoodies that really made me think of the way masks have so often been evoked for the performance of Blackness in public, and sort of it's like the idea of, if you are you look threatening, and so you're responsible for your own victimization. If you don't take control over the way you perform yourself in public, somehow you are responsible and culpable for sort of the violence that can result from that. So there's a lot about masking, and that was also the connection with minstrelsy, and just people strategizing to survive. And the main character, so he thinks he's the last survivor, and someone told him, he was 9 when this happened, to not come out because he was hiding until he heard someone call him by his name, because if they don't know your name, you can't trust him. So in a lot of ways, he's still hiding, and he's still waiting for someone to call him by his real name. So that's a lot of what's going on in there. I don't know if that answered any questions that you had.
No, there's also, I mean, you're creating the dialogue. Your answers come with more questions, to be honest, lady, which is a good thing. But like, even just thinking about the sacredness of the name, mm-hmm. right? There's the protection. I mean, thinking about masking going beyond this to like, now what information can people have, and like the magic of, my real name versus, the name I give you, or even a nickname, and not refraining from giving your hometown as well.
Right. So yeah, he won't talk about any of that. Consciously, he's like, that's probably not necessary anymore, because it's like, 20 years later, but it's still very deeply shaped who he is and how he moves through the world. Yeah.
So, is there something, if anything, that you want to say about orphans and labor before, I mean, in 1917, of course, before we wrap up this segment?
Oh, about orphans in particular?
Yeah,
I really wanted it to be about someone trying to, the plot turns into his efforts to just keep these boys alive because they are constantly being threatened, and he tries literally everything he can think of to keep them safe. And that was a big part of what that was emotionally, just thinking about that this is something 100 years ago, and people still feel that level of anxiety in terms of the safety of their children and the vulnerability of their children to racial violence because of all of this stuff that I'm, referencing. Yeah.
Right. There's also, I think, something about the way new families are made by the way capitalism structures labor.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so like you come across people who become family who aren't, right? Now the boys all look alike, but it's not that they are brothers. Now they have different protectors, but it's not like these are their given protectors, and it's all united around this labor, right?
Yes.
Like this is what connected them.
Yes. And I thought a lot, I mean, I didn't talk a lot, but there's a second half of the book where it's actually Ginny, who he sees in the hall, is told from her perspective. It's like a decade later, and all of her relationships initially are monetized. They're all about money, and people being dependent on her for a paycheck or to pay a bill or something like that. But literally all of her relationships are monetized first in that way. So yeah.
Lady, where can we find you? Where can we follow you?
I have a website, and it's my name, ladyhubbard.com. And yeah, so.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can we give it up for Lady in the chat? Everybody, thank you so much for your time and your answers and your dialogue. We're going to bring to the stage, everybody. Hold up. Let's keep the energy up. And the only way to do that is through the chat. We're winding down, but also winding up. So let's not forget that we're bringing Aliyah Dawn Johnson to the stage, y'all. She is a Nebula Award-winning short story writer and the author of 7 novels for adults and young adults. Her most recent novel for adults, Trouble the Saints, won the 2021 World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. Her debut YA young adult novel, The Summer Prince, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, and the follow-up, Love is the Drug, was awarded the Andre Norton Nebula Award. Her short stories have appeared in many magazines and anthologies, most notably the title story in The Memory Librarian, in collaboration with Janelle Monáe. She lives in Oaxaca, Mexico. Currently, can we give it up for Miss Johnson?
Thank you so much, Candace. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. I've been so overwhelmed listening to my amazing fellow nominees' works. Holy crap, to be in such company. I'm going to read the very beginning part of the title story from my collection, Reconstruction. And okay, let's get started. In January of '63, my boys shared camp downriver from Beaufort with the 54th Massachusetts, who had among them a gunner of an intellectual disposition. Having been born free, he learned his letters young and read diligently of whatever improving literature he could find. He helped me teach the men their letters that winter as we celebrated the passing of Lincoln's proclamation into law. He had developed what he termed a taxonomy of anger. The gunner, called Flip, liked to expound upon his theory on watch, or when we stayed up late on cold nights, drinking moonshine whiskey and blinking back smoke from a damp fire of Spanish moss and live oak. As a woman, nominally the company laundress, I never warmed I never warned myself after a turn at the pickets with Flip, but I did spend a part of most nights around that fire, so that even all these years later, I have only to smell a bit of brackish marsh and burning pitch to remember more vividly than my present time the men laughing and Flip saying in his serious young man's voice, "The first and best is righteousness, that anger which speaks divinity." You could pick the officers from the infantry by noting the slow, considering nods which greeted this observation. Their heads dipped before the fire, grimly pleased at their unexpected reflection. They had long since learned to harness that pure flame, these veterans of many engagements who knew they must face yet further. Flip had primary care of the sow the men called Piggy, a guinea hog of pneumatic memories who had come to us as an adolescent and now behaved in camp like an oversized dog. Clarence, a drummer boy for the 1st South Carolina, had been known to ride Piggy into evening praise meetings with Flip leading the charge, much to the general hilarity of the men and the ire of Billy Brown, a corporal in the 1st South Carolina who was fixing to become a preacher when the war ended, and took to the praise meetings as though he'd already been ordained. I had reason to know the hop and collar of my Father Brown, as he had kept his eye on me all spring and summer of '62, believing it my womanly duty to reward his attention with my favors. This ranked fourth in Flip's schema as affront, that which pricks at one's pride but not one's dignity, though it seemed to me that this unduly privileged Billy Brown's perspective on the matter. His second and third, fury and vengefulness, switched places often over the course of that long, still winter. After some Rebs snuck past our pickets and killed 10 men in their sleep, Flip joined the retaliatory mission led by Sergeant Major Whitaker, a young Black officer of mysterious origins who had come to us early that summer and whom Colonel Higginson quickly came to hold in much esteem. All that fall, Bo Whitaker had taken to picking the herbs I liked whenever he found them outside camp, but he returned that winter night with nothing in his haversack but a rattle of teeth, cracked and bloody at the roots. "We did for them," he said, observing a molar seamed black with abscessed caries. Some Reb's jaw had hurt like hell, but not anymore. In dying, he had passed that burden somehow to my kind-eyed soldier. 12 hiding in the mud by the estuary, white rats. Bought 2 slaves with them. Flip has them now. And days later, the 1st South Carolina's 2 newest soldiers were drinking the sweet nectar of freedom, which had in this case a salutary burn of contraband whiskey. Zali and Guillaume were brothers, natives to these waterways, though their mother had been a Creole from Baton Rouge. They were laughing, good-natured boys, eager to share our fire and our stories, and nodded when Flip elevated vengefulness to the grim honor of 2nd place. "But those Johnny Rebs," said the younger one, Guillaume, "they got plenty of vengefulness too. They'd string us up quicker than a Christmas turkey." He gave his brother a conspiratorial glance, and Zali finished, "If they could catch us." Flip's back stiffened. Anger that grows in the soil of deprivation is a holy fruit, while that which is sown in the soil of overabundance grows crooked and full of poison. It is beneath our consideration. Third, still indispensable, he ranked fury, that berserking wrath which bursts forth after long confinement. Flip was a freedman who had never known a day's bondage, but with this he named and mapped the power that made the Negro regiments the terror of Johnny Reb. I felt it too when I stared dead-eyed at the stinking midden of disarticulated flesh outside the medical tent. A devil and a sawbones had carved my heart clean of pity and horror, and at first only fury filled that empty cavity. But in my later years, it has been that 5th, overlooked anger who has abided and kept her step with mine after all the others fell aside. After Bo died and Grandma came to help me with our baby, I felt her, a canker, a hard stone beneath a camp-stitched wound, turning. $10 Seneca Stone Company read the check from the men who had killed Sergeant Major Bo Whitaker for the savings of a scaffold repair and made me a widow at 23. Gall, I heard Flip say that night, across the chasm of all my deaths and 4 hard years. The 5th and the least, that bitter medicine, the grime of commonplace indignity, which collects in the soul day by day and grows there like a cancer. And that's all I'll read for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alaya. Can we give it up for Alaya in the chat, y'all? So I want to ask you to talk about I'm gonna say it this way, and you can correct it in your answer. But the idea of your characters mapping trauma or mapping grief or mapping, like, figuring their way through these emotions and what emotions are allowable or even wanted. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this story was. It took me, it's a novella, but it took me years to write. Partly because of this sort of this mapping, because like in this section, it's just this sort of taxonomy of anger. You have like these 5 angers, but like the story kind of goes on, and it's also obviously it's dealing with trauma and grief and sadness and kind of like these stages of like the stages of grief, of like coming to terms with the traumas you have gone through, especially because it's in this kind of liminal time in during the Civil War, when the Black regiments had all the hope in the world of the way that the world was going to change, and the way that promise was brutally betrayed by the violent end of the Reconstruction period, I think is one of those kind of like the great trauma of African Americans, basically, that I wanted to kind of get back to that original kind of collective trauma. But it was also because I was doing a lot of therapy, and I was going through a lot of like my own personal trauma, and kind of trying to like reconcile my own feelings of anger and grief and like all of that. So it kind of ended up becoming like this sort of weird way that I was going back to understand this collective trauma, because I was going through the sort of like mini version of that kind of Civil War, or that kind of feeling of finally being able to confront, or finally being able to feel or express, right, like emotions that you weren't allowed to express, because that's also part of what's going on. Like these soldiers are able to give voice to feelings that would have possibly gotten them killed before, when they were enslaved, so like and it's kind of the first time that they were able to express that. So that was a lot of what was going on in my head when I was writing it, for sure.
And they come out in these proverbs, right? Like this is a proverb on anger. This is a proverb on where anger can meet fury. This is a proverb on, and so it's interesting how in building the taxonomy, even though we're talking about one stage of a larger emotional event, it is the stage that is most important for these characters in this moment.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's one of those things where you can see like the whole in a part, right? You can see, and and my main character kind of describes it, right? Like how, at one point she's feeling this kind of anger, at the other point, but now she's just kind of like stuck on this bitter gall, like, so that at each point in her life she can feel different parts of it, but like that anger keeps abiding. I mean, and then it's, as the story goes on, it's kind of like, but is it always just anger, or is this anger like covering up some other emotion? I mean, I think that's totally true. Like that you don't feel it all necessarily at once, but that there's little seeds of the other emotions in each one.
Absolutely. So now what brings in a different element, especially if we're talking about anger, is that your protagonist is a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And she is talking about something that's typically masculine or seen as masculine, right? She's giving us the overview of these soldiers. But like anger, when it comes to like women, especially in this era, it gives us I don't know, a different layer of ways that it can or cannot be expressed, what is or isn't acceptable. Do you want to talk more about that?
Oh yeah, totally. In fact, that was one of those elements that that came out more as I was like writing and rewriting, because she's a woman in a very masculine coded space who ends up, I mean, she takes a lover because she loves him, but also she realizes how much it kind of like makes her life simpler because of the way, she's kind of coded as this sort of like fungible good, unless someone has claimed her, and that, there's different kind of degrees of freedom. And that's something that, that part of her kind of like bitterness and gall like comes because of that. And because most of the men in the company aren't like willing to pay attention to the struggles that she is herself going through, which are similar but different from theirs. And it's, it's sort of prefiguring a lot of kind of like later conversations that we continue to have, and so I think that was important to me because partly because I very much was inspired by and based the kind of like broad strokes of this story on the memoir by Susie Taylor King of Black women's Civil War memoirs, and she was a woman who was in fact like serving in with the First South Carolina as a laundress, and and this is, as far as anyone knows, kind of like the only memoir of its kind that actually talks about like an experience of a Black woman in the Civil War. And it was really interesting to me the way that Susie King Taylor doesn't really describe directly her kind of that access of things. And she tends to focus a little more broadly on like herself as identifying with the men of the regiment. But there's kind of a few little details, like a few little throwaway lines that made me really wonder. And I think that was sort of what I started to try to like draw out those elements, because there's still a kind of a feeling that it's not politic, or we can't talk about like our particular struggles as Black women because you have to be like, in solidarity with Black men. And it's not like, those two things necessarily have to be like in conflict with one another, but it's like, you can't, like, when do we get our chance, And so I feel like in some ways the Civil War is kind of when like no one thinks we should get our chance. But this woman wrote this memoir like in that exact time period, it's not like we weren't around. So I felt like I liked, and I thought it was really important to try to bring out that aspect of that struggle, not, to resolve it obviously, but just to, show that it was there and that it affected her life.
Thank you. So when you're working as the writer through the narrator speaking about the other character, how as the writer did you approach speaking to and speaking from these issues?
Mm-hmm. It's always complicated writing historical fiction, and like even more so historical fiction, which is in some loose way inspired by historical figure. I mean, I made it very clear that I'm not writing Susie Taylor King's story. Like that's not what I'm setting out to do. But it's dedicated to her. It's obviously a huge influence on me. So part of it is a sort of like maintaining enough of a separation, like an understanding, like I, as a modern 21st century writer, am not going to be able to fully inhabit that voice. I mean, I can do my best, but I'm not actually from that time period, so there was a lot of that sort of like trying to like signal, and also, but there's a reason why I wanted to tell this story. There's a reason why I felt so drawn to it. And it's because of all of the ways like those themes keep coming up, and that this original trauma, and I, obviously there are many original traumas, but I feel like very particularly like that feeling of hope during the Civil War and that complete betrayal at the violent end of Reconstruction is in many ways kind of the defining moment for so much of African American history, because it keeps happening over and over and over again. It's like we just kind of got stuck in this hideous loop. I mean, that's kind of, in a lot of ways, that's a lot of the story, even behind things like, the Tulsa race riots, like this way that we kind of get some power, we kind of have some hope, we kind of achieve something, and then that has to be brutally repressed, like over and over and over again. And so like that was, what I wanted to like talk about, but also it was a little complicated because my own distance, my own kind of history. I mean, I'm not, Lord knows, not someone who was raised in those conditions in any way. So there's a lot of kind of trying to learn a lot about the past and like inhabit those characters without forgetting that there's a certain kind of distance between us that I can't bridge. But that writing, I feel like when I'm doing it well, I'm channeling in some way something that's beyond me or that's greater than me. And that was what I felt I was doing when I was writing it.
Thank you. Beautiful. Where can we find you? What are you working on now?
I'm working on my latest young adult novel, which is a totally out there science fiction novel that is coming out in spring or June of 2023 called The Library of Broken Worlds. And I'm working on some other things, which see you around. And I'm on Twitter at Alaya DJ, like intermittently, and online at alayadonjohnson.com.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for thinking through these ideas with me, helping me understand. Thank you all for joining us. Congratulations to our nominees. Please join us. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of the Voices of Legacy, and be sure to tune in tomorrow for the 2022 Legacy Awards. You can get more info on Eventbrite, and I can post that link here. So I hope to see you guys there. Let me get that link here posted for you guys before you hop out of the chat. And can you give a big shout out to everybody, to all our readers here? Thank you guys. I hope the energy was high enough for y'all in the chat. You can't see us, but you can feel us. You can feel us, and it's going to be even more lit tomorrow. Thank you guys for being here and taking this time. And I'm going to stop talking now.